Welcome to the latest edition of the Lownie Report. We'll be talking about some of the new disclosures, particularly about the release of some of the Epstein material, and particularly we'll be looking at the non-release of some of Prince Andrew's papers in the end of the year release from the National Archives, and the story of how some material was released and then reclosed. And this is a big problem for historians. I'll be talking about some of my own experiences over the years on exactly this issue.
So let's kick off then with the latest news, Andrew. What exactly happened with these cabinet files last week?
Well, it's a very interesting story. Jack Blackburn from the Times rang me up. He had been there to look at this material. The government release these papers always at Christmas time when they think everyone's on holiday and no one will notice. And they're meant to release basically everything from 20 years ago for each year. Now, they don't do that. It's actually a very selective release. Some of this material which they feed to the press is digitalized. It's easy for them to look at. Some of it isn't. And it's a bit of a sleight of hand because not everything that's released they tell you about. And what happened here was that there was a reference to something called the Royal Visits Committee, which is what rubber stamps the trips that people like Prince Andrew made as a trade envoy. Now, I tried to get access to the Royal Visits Committee material. I couldn't get anything, I think, earlier than the 1980s. It actually is a very innocent committee. It's chaired by the Permanent Under Secretary of the Foreign Office, I think. The Queen's or King's private secretary sits on it, and one or two other people. And what was interesting in this case was that basically they changed the funding, and £90,000 was going to be moved from one funding era to another. And we did a piece about that, and that was due to run. And then the journalists suddenly noticed that this material, which had been available to them days before, suddenly wasn't available. And it seems the Cabinet Office claimed that this was an administrative error, that the material should never have been released in the first place. It was all completely innocent, I should say. But the press got a sniff of something was afoot here. And they began to write articles about the fact the stuff was being censored. Now, this has been going on for years, material which has been in the archives for a long time and then is reclosed. And they often use excuses like data protection. And I had a case when I was writing my book on Traitor King, the King Edward VIII book, where I actually asked for a police protection file on Edward from the 1930s for my research. I gave as evidence that there were 20 of these files in the 1930s available. They were all very innocent. They'd all been available for 20 years. The Metropolitan Police claimed this would affect Edward's security if it was released, and the Information Commissioner agreed with them. This is the sort of ombudsman that deals with freedom of information. I took the case to the first tier tribunal, which is the basically a court case that looks at these matters. And the judge said, well, if this material has been available for 20 years, let's see it and let's see how it compares with this disputed file. I discovered that in the course of this, I went to get this material and I found it had been closed. It had been closed because of this court case. And I thought this was some contempt of court. The judge said that he couldn't really adjudicate on it. So I wasn't able to present this evidence in my court case. I actually won and got the release of the file I wanted. But this material, and including a famous file which was about the surveillance of Wallis Simpson in the 1930s, MEPO 1035, which has appeared on TV programs. It was actually, I think, even on the website of the National Archives, might still be there. It's been heavily copied by historians. That was one of the files that was closed. So we have this extraordinary situation where the file that that had been closed is now opened, and the files that had been open for 20 years are still closed years later. So anyway, this is a very similar situation. This Royal Visits Committee file has now been closed. No one can look at it. It's all completely, as I say, innocent. But people began to get their, say, a bit suspicious about this, and it's now raised bigger questions about the way that the Cabinet Office in particular, which is the government department which liaises most closely with the royal household, is not releasing material that it should do under the Public Records Act, material that should come out after 20 years. I've been trying to get access to the files on Andrew's time as a trade envoy for the period 2001 to 2011. And so the files up to 2005 should be released. They aren't being released. No one seems to know where they are. The government use every excuse possible not to release them. First of all, they say my requests are too wide. I need to narrow them. When I narrow them, I'm told that they've got nothing. They use all sorts of excuses, national security, relations with another country, even the royal exemption, Section 37. So they're determined that these files aren't released. Now, one of the things I discovered in my research through an FOI was that Andrew's papers had been closed till 2065, so 5 years after the centenary of his birth. Now, when I queried this with, for example, the Information Commissioner, they said that this was a completely made up release date, that, the Public Records Act was very clear on all this. So people now are beginning to look at this question of records release, archives management, and asking some very good questions. We've seen editorials, and particularly in the Independent on this, but also in the Guardian. And I hope this will now really bring to the fore this extraordinary censoring of our history, particularly royal history. My own feeling is that many of these files are sent to Buckingham Palace. They don't get sent to the National Archives, and Buckingham Palace sits on them. I suspect gets rid of some of the stuff, and the other stuff goes to the Royal Archives at Windsor, where no one can look at them again. And I've had this sort of experience time and time again. The problem with the Royal Archives is there is no public inventory. So when you go there and ask for documents, you basically say, what have you got on Edward VIII? And they'll give you what they choose to give you. It's a bit like a restaurant with no menu. And historians are getting a little fed up with this. They also regulate the way that you can use the archives. So many historians are not allowed to attend, or they pretend that they're actually booked up and there's no slot for you. So I found that I had to wait months on end to go and look at the archives. When I got there, I found in the book for people signing in that hardly anyone was there. When I was there were only, if I was lucky, one other historian. And so they use this as a way of controlling access to material. And I certainly have an author that I represent who's doing a book on the Duke of Kent's father, who died in a air crash in the Second World War. And his papers, voluminous papers, no one's been ever able to write a book about him because they claim they have nothing on him. And this is, of real concern, because documents are the way that we tell this history of the past. And if we don't have the documents, we can't tell that story. And the royals have a long tradition of destroying archives. They were still destroying Queen Victoria's archives and diaries in the reign of George V, so 2 reigns on. We know that Princess Margaret destroyed many of the Queen Mother's files. We know that the Queen's own papers are being sorted not by historians, but by her former valet, Paul Wybrow, not a person who's been trained to look at historical documents. And one wonders what, again, is going to be placed in the archives and what has been retained or destroyed. We know that Prince Philip spent many years at the end of his life ordering his documents, rearranging them, and presumably getting rid of anything he felt might be embarrassing. And we've seen this with so many people. I think Diana's papers were destroyed. As I say, Princess Margaret's chauffeur burnt huge amounts of papers in bins at Kensington Palace. And this is really concerning to us as historians, that these pieces of history are being destroyed. When I did my research on Traitor King, I actually had the good luck to talk to the man in Special Branch who was responsible for releasing the files on the abdication, and particularly on the surveillance of Wallis Simpson. Now, these files, which went back to the 1930s, were released only after the Queen Mother's death in 2005. And one of the things he revealed was that only one representative file, the famous MEPO 1035, was released. The rest of them were destroyed on the grounds that only one representative file needed to be made public. Now, in a time when files can be very easily digitalized, it isn't a problem with storage. And when we are dealing with basically artifacts of history, I mean, this is rather tragic that low-level special branch officers are deciding which bits of history are kept and which bits are destroyed. And one of the arguments is that there was very little surveillance of Wallis Simpson. But actually, what we're discovering is there was extensive surveillance, just it wasn't kept. So I do hope that what happened at Christmas this year will begin to generate a much wider debate about archives management. I was talking to an archivist at the Ministry of Defence the other day who was appalled that papers going back to the Second World War important papers related to Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which were held in some of the Ministry of Defense's warehouses, and which at the moment there's quite a lot of MOD material property which is being sold off. They were, instead of having a proper archives management team go in to preserve material and make sure it gets to the National Archives, this material was being chucked into skips because no one could be bothered to actually keep it. And as he said, important files relating to the Second World War, which had been kept for 80 years, were now being binned. And one hears countless stories like this. I actually put in FOI requests, and I think one of the ones to the Foreign Office was something like 16,000 files are destroyed each year with no public record kept. Now, of course, some of these files are administrative files, they may be duplicates, and there are good reasons they're not kept. But the decision about keeping them is left to some very low-level people. The sensitivity reviewers who look at this material, generally former civil servants, they tend to be, by their nature, quite cautious in clearly what they're preserving. They're often looking at material that they themselves were involved in. So if one of their mates was caught in a brothel, is as one of the cases, that's the sort of material that gets destroyed. And I think one of the worrying things is that there is a national advisory body that is a sort of meant to be like executive directors looking at archives releases, but it's packed with former spooks, civil servants, people who are basically not going to rock the boat. And anyone who like me has tried to get on the committee has never really got beyond the first paper sift. And the result is that a lot of the stuff is just being destroyed without anyone being able to have any oversight about it. So it's a huge problem. And as I say, I've encountered it throughout all the books I've done, actually, since Guy Burgess. Very few historians, I think, I can't understand why, but seem unperturbed by this. I think they've just grown to accept that that's what happens, and they have to try and find their way around this. When I did the book on Traitor King, I found that most of the files on Edward in the Bahamas during the war in the Colonial Office had been extensively weeded. But by chance, in the Bahamas, there were mirror copies of all those files, and they revealed very embarrassing information. For example, that Edward had actually moved the head of the police to another island on the day when there was a murder of a man called Harry Oakes, a murder in which the Duke of Windsor was implicated and he was involved. He was involved in a money-making operation with Oakes, and he was clearly covering up what had the murder. And this happens time and time again where files are taken away. Again, I often look in what we call adjacent files. So often innocent files like, I don't know, Department of Public Works or Ministry of Agriculture will be copied into files and haven't been weeded. But often you will find this material in foreign files or even private files, belying the fact that or emphasizing the fact that this material did exist. It's just been taken out of most of the official files. And again, one of the disturbing things that I'm discovering with my research now, particularly with Epstein and Prince Andrew, is a lot of material, for example, on Andrew's time as a trade envoy, talking to whistleblowers in the DTI, was basically destroyed at the time. The flight logs, for example, were never kept. Some of the files about his expenses were lost in general accounting, so they couldn't be traced. We know that a lot of discussions are done on post-it notes and therefore not recorded, that they're private meetings between people which are never minuted. And so again, our history is not being recorded. And this, of course, is to protect activities which shouldn't be going on, either corruption or abuses of people's position.
And how did they argue with a straight face that Edward's security would be compromised when he died in the 70s?
Well, the argument is that the techniques that they use haven't changed in terms of royal protection. Now, I wanted to point out that these protection files don't have anything to do with the protection techniques. They're actually, for example, the chits that the protection officer puts in for his expenses. They may be mad people who've written in and they record these letters. And Di Davis, who we've interviewed, has pointed out that all the techniques for royal security have changed, even since he was in charge. technology clearly has moved on. So there's no danger of any security breach. But that's, of course, always their get out of jail free card, national security, their protection. But the ridiculous thing is that we do know, for example, the floor plan of Buckingham Palace because we've got it from Prince Harry's book Spare. We know that Andrew was letting people into Buckingham Palace with all access passes who hadn't even been named to security at the gate and prostitutes he was bringing in. So they're doing far more damage to their own security than anything that could be done in terms of files being released. No one has ever gone to the National Archives and found something to mount some sort of operation against the royal family. And why would they? Why would they wade through thousands of pages of paper? They would require a reader's ticket. It would all be monitored. It just hasn't happened. So these are just excuses that they trot out. And unfortunately, the Information Commissioner supports them, and now the judges are supporting them. And we've got to remember that there are very few maverick judges. People know what's expected of them. People don't get jobs like, for example, sitting on these information tribunals unless people think that they're going to be jolly good chaps and do what's required of them. And I've certainly had experiences, for example, in my case on the Mountbatten diaries, where I did have a very sympathetic judge. He was the person who ordered Southampton to actually make available to him these closed files, which should have been available to the public 10 years earlier, bought with public monies. But suddenly, after he made that decision, he was moved to another case, and someone else was put on the case, who not only was very unsympathetic to my case, but actually, and this was something that even shocked my lawyers, refused to award costs in my favour, even though I won the case, and Southampton and the Cabinet Office have been in contempt of court. So you kind of feel that you're operating with one hand behind your back. Time and time again, I've seen files with very extensive indexes at the front of the files of what they contain. And when you open the files, there's hardly anything there. They've been very, very heavily what we call dry cleaned. And it's a scandal. But the problem is that there's no one is in a position to challenge this. And there are lone voices like me who speak out, but we're dismissed as nutters. And the caravan moves on and business as usual.
Has it got more and more difficult for you as you've written more books?
Yes, yes, it has got much more difficult. I mean, ironically, MI5 are one of the best and most open of all the government departments, and they have a regular system of releases. I mean, it's not everything. So, for example, they released a lot of material on Burgess just after my book came out in 2015. And there's just been a new release of material on Blunt in January last year. But we've had very little on Philby. We've had, for example, the security department of the Foreign Office files on Burgess, but very little of the MI5 files. We've had no material on, very little material on Cairncross, I say a little bit on Blunt, but very much Philby still needs to be released. My argument is they should be releasing everything at the same time, all the files, so historians can basically say, well, we've got everything and we can now write the story as completely as we want. So they kind of cherry pick and they take a little bit here, a little bit there, just enough to feed some person's interest, which is very frustrating because we get a series of books which only have half the story. The Cabinet Office, who are actually in charge of FOI, are actually the worst offenders in terms of failing to respond on time, failing to give answers, turning down requests most often. And one of the problems I found with some of my stuff is the Cabinet Office are the paymaster to everyone, including the Information Commissioner, who should be completely independent. He is independent, reports to Parliament in Scotland, but not in England. And so the Information Commissioner is very reluctant to challenge the Cabinet Office because all the Cabinet Office does is squeeze the funding on the Information Commissioner, making their life more difficult. And that's what they've done. So there are fewer staff now dealing with FOI requests. There are more people doing data protection, which has also been put under the auspices of the Information Commissioner. The two roles should be separated. So what the Cabinet Office do very skillfully is they have been cutting the budgets to the Information Commissioner, even though the workload has gone up. And therefore, the ICO has to cherry pick what they look at, and they can do far less. And it's much easier, of course, to just turn down requests rather than to fully investigate them. And that is a big problem, and it needs to be addressed by Parliament. There have been a few parliamentary committees, but the problem is none of the people in Parliament seem to be very interested in this. There are plenty of all-party groups on the Bahamas and lovely places you can go and visit, which are very sunny. There is no parliamentary group that looks at archives. And so the whole story just really doesn't get covered.
And another thing that you've spoken about before is the fact that you've come across evidence that sometimes files are planted in archives. Can you talk about that?
Yes, we had an interesting case a few years ago with father and son, Peter and Martin Allen, who were quoting documents for books they did on the Second World War, which were pretty controversial and sensational. And it emerged really after a newspaper investigation that they'd faked these documents, that they'd taken into the National Archives and then quoted them. And of course, you're searched when you leave archives, but you're not searched when you go in. I think that's now changing, and you now have to show your papers, and they're quite strict. And they weren't very good forgeries. And it was extraordinary that this hadn't been discovered earlier. But I've had two cases which I have raised flags for me. One was when I was doing the Mountbatten book. I found an account of Edwina Mountbatten's death and sudden death in Borneo in 1960, an account by the acting governor Turner. And this was an account that was scattered throughout the Mountbatten archives at Southampton. It was in the Bodleian. This was a report that clearly was placed to be found. And what seemed odd to me was it didn't tie in with the information I was getting elsewhere, one of which was that she'd committed suicide, another was she'd been murdered, the fact that there was no proper autopsy after the sudden death abroad, there was no record of her body being repatriated, all these things. When you die abroad, there's lots and lots of paperwork, and there was nothing. It all seemed very suspicious. She died very suddenly, but there was no record of her being ill until this point. She was only in her 50s when she died. So that was one thing that I thought was just very strange. The other was doing Traitor King. And there's a famous report done when Blunt went to Germany at the end of the war with the Queen's, or then the King's Librarian, Owen Morshead, ostensibly to look for artifacts and liberate them before the Russians moved in and took them from some of the German homes, aristocratic homes there. But there have always been strong rumours that he was there to pick up incriminating material relating to the Duke of Windsor and indeed to Queen Mary and other correspondence with their Hesse relations. And this was certainly something I found in a diary in Keble College, Oxford, an army officer there who did a diary who was based in the castle in which Blunt had visited, talking about finding this incriminating material in the library there. And I'd found evidence from research in American archives for what was called the Monuments Men, or what became the film The Monuments Men, where they did a report of Blunt's trip to Germany to look for these artifacts, which certainly he did as part of that trip. But their account and the account that's in the Owen Moorhead's version in the Royal Archives differs. And I just was very suspicious of this Owen Moorhead's account, which just seemed to me didn't fit in with all the information I was getting. And, the black arts, I'm afraid, are practiced by the government and the royal household to put people off the trail. And, we do know that not everything in archives is accurate. Just because something is in, for example, an FBI file, we've seen this, for example, with Epstein. Just because people put in interviewed and said various things doesn't mean it's true. And that was certainly true with the Duke of Windsor. There was material there, interviews, which aren't necessarily true, but of course the FBI have to record and it's in their files. So, as I say, we think archives are accurate, but, the documentation doesn't always tell the full story. And of course, the documentation is often not there. I had an interesting occasion lecturing on a cruise a couple of years ago. And one of the things I said was all the rumours were that Wallis Simpson had an affair with Ribbentrop, the German ambassador, but there's no paperwork to stand it up, and therefore it probably didn't happen. And then a man came up to me at the end of the talk and he said, well, I'm the grandson of the chauffeur to Ribbentrop. And the family stories are that Wallis Simpson and Ribbentrop were having an affair, and often that my grandfather would take them to and fro the various homes. So this is oral history, and sometimes oral history can be as accurate, if not more accurate, than the documentation which has been basically filtered, because there's often some strength in the stories that are passed down through families.
What effect does all of this have on royal historians? So, are there favoured royal historians who are given access where unfavoured historians are not? And in what ways does the royal family use all of these various systems of secrecy to control the narrative?
Yes, the narrative of oral history is controlled very much by the royal household. There are favoured historians who are given access, given allowed to talk to people. It's a bit like official histories with intelligence. There are some favoured historians who are allowed to tell the story because they feel they can be trusted and they're not going to scare the horses. And that's, I can think of one particular historian who is a deputy lieutenant and runs one of the quangos, writes very favorable royal histories and clearly avoids anything which is embarrassing. And I find often I'm looking at papers which other historians must have looked at. They could easily have reported the things I've reported, but for whatever reason have chosen not to do so. There are people, there are journalists clearly within the royal rota who, for access to the royal family, will not ask too many tough questions. We saw that with Amy Robach and ABC Television, and which you can see as a thing on YouTube, where ABC backed off an investigation into Andrew because they were worried about losing access to members of the royal family for interviews. At the same time, there are people who are taken off the royal rota. Tom Sykes is a good example for the Daily Beast because he writes things that they don't necessarily like. So he has to rely on a whole series of his own contacts, which come from being very well connected. And I've always kind of run up the outside. I've never really had very rarely had insiders feeding me material. I've had to rely on documents. I've had to rely on finding people on the periphery. So, for example, with Andrew, it was school friends, it was people in the Navy. And I did get one person on his staff. But generally, I didn't get the sort of people that often talk to many of the other royal writers. So yeah, and I think people are getting fed up with these hagiographies, which won't touch important issues. People knew about Lord Mountbatten's paedophilia, but wouldn't talk about it. People knew that Edward VIII had been a traitor to Britain, but it just, pretended that he was a naive dupe rather than actually a willing participant. Everyone actually, or lots of people knew about Andrew's very poor behavior, the way he'd monetized his position in the royal family, but didn't want to talk about it. And you can't write biographies if you're only telling half the story. And I think the public have got fed up with that and now expect both journalists and historians to tell the truth as far as they can. I've had an experience, for example, with my book, doing my research on Prince Philip. People have denied me access to or refuse to talk to me because they're worried that I'm going to talk about some of Prince Philip's mistresses. Well, you can't tell the story of Prince Philip, a man I much admire, and I think it's going to be a very positive biography, but you can't tell that story without mentioning the mistresses. And this is, extraordinary. It's still going on.
And how long will it be, do you think, before we get a comprehensive biography of the Queen, the late Queen, that is not a hagiography? Do you think it'll be in your lifetime, my lifetime?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, there have been some quite good books on the Queen, one by Sarah Bradford and another by Ben Pimlott. And I think her reputation has changed quite considerably, even in the last few months. I mean, the revelation that she basically protected Andrew, that she didn't always put the monarchy ahead of her own family, I think has made people look at her in a new light. Clearly, it's more difficult to write about her if the papers aren't available, and there's no sign of them being made available. They should be made available, I understand, 3 years after her death. There's no sign of an official historian being appointed to even write the official history. And so I think I think we will see biographies appearing in the next few years. It's a big task. And I think this is one of the problems for an official biographer. You're having to deal with 70 years. Someone was suggesting that you should have allocated subjects. So one did, her in the Commonwealth, another did, I don't know, her in the 1990s. I mean, my own preference would be to make sure that the material is available to all historians and then leave it as a free-for-all for historians to just basically make their own choice what they want to write about, and but they all be given equal access, and there wouldn't be special privileges given to some and not to others. And but that just depends on the papers being made available. And at the moment, we don't know when those papers will be made available and how extensive that will be. There are also, of course, important papers at places like the Bodleian and Churchill College, Cambridge, relating to, for example, courtiers and their diaries, and whether they will be opened up. So, there's some big questions, but I would hope within the next 10 years we'll have a stronger sense of what went on during her reign. But we're still discovering things about the Victorians. We're still discovering things about the Second World War. So we're not going to get the full story, I think, until maybe the next century, if then.
So, how much of this is also publishers self-censoring? So, for example, we've spoken before about an author of yours who wanted to publish a book about Mountbatten, about the children's home, and they weren't able to do so. How much is there a kind of self-censorship with publishers when it comes to telling certain types of stories about the royals?
Yes, I think there's a lot of self-censorship. I mean, publishers don't want the hassle and the cost of dealing with lawyers, and so they shy away often from controversial subjects. I have an author who wanted to do a book on royal finances, very well-respected author. His regular publisher was offered the book, and they said they didn't want to do it because of royal sensitivities. And both he and I assumed from that the person running the publishing house was angling for an honor and wasn't going to get an honor if he brought this book out. So yeah, we don't know what's censored because a lot of stuff we just don't. If it's never published, then we just don't know. And of course, publishers can use all sorts of excuses not to publish books. I know of a case of a book on Prince William where the contract's been cancelled. Now, whether a very good book, I've read it. I know whether that's because they feel it might cause some ripples and they don't want the hassle, or who knows what the reason is. But it's a very commercial book, and it seems very odd that a publisher whose prime motive should be to make money has not just commissioned the book originally, but is now cancelling it with all the attendant publicity to go with that.
And let's talk about Parliament then. So, we know that there's a Public Accounts Committee inquiry into the Crown estate, but you were talking to Norman Baker in the most recent episode, and I hadn't realised that MPs aren't allowed to, basically, they're not allowed to criticise the monarchy in Parliament. I think the wording was impugn the monarch, is that right?
Yes, anything that impugns the dignity of the monarchy. And there's a sort of Bible in Parliament called Erskine May. And when you want to go and ask parliamentary questions, for example, you have to go to one of the clerk's offices and put your question in, and they will basically ban questions which touch on the royal family. Not even if necessarily critical. You can have no questions about the royal family, both in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Now, this, I hope, is changing, and certainly you couldn't have parliamentary committees look at the royal family. Now, this is changing. We've now got the Public Accounts Committee looking at the cost of the Crown estate properties and the very cosy arrangements with members of the royal family, including non-working royals who have subsidised accommodation. And the Crown Estates is a public body. It should be trying to get the most money for the public purse. They should not be giving cheap deals to Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. So that is a welcome sign. I think we are going to get more questions now being asked about Andrew's times of trade envoy, I hope. And of course, governments will always find very bland ways of responding, so they don't have to give anything away. But I think we're moving forward to some sort of scrutiny of the royal family. It's been described as Britain's most protected institution, and that's certainly true. I mean, everyone's will in this country is public, except members, even pretty obscure members of the royal family. Everyone is subject, or public authorities are all subject to the Freedom of Information Act, except members of the royal family. Parliamentarians have to declare their business interests and gifts in the parliamentary lobby sort of register. The royal family do have a gifts register, but we know that they don't fully fill it out. They just put a few things in. And they're often caught. I mean, one of the things with Andrews, he was caught going to places only because the Royal Register, the sort of the gifts register, had said he'd been given some sort of gift, but there'd be no reference, for example, in the court circular. And time again, I found that the court circular was saying he was somewhere, and things like the Lolita flight logs were saying he was somewhere else. And I mean, particularly a famous trip that he was supposed to have gone to Boston with for Outward Bound, when in fact he was in New York with Epstein. So even the court circular, which is meant to be a very accurate record of royal activities, actually seems to be fudged and is protecting and disguising what they're really up to.
So what's emerging is that it's essentially impossible to hold the royal family to account, to understand what they're doing behind the scenes, unless they take it upon themselves, like they have with Andrew, for example, after huge public pressure, to do anything about it. So they're entirely self-policing.
Yes, they are entirely self-policing. I mean, for example, the Duchy of Cornwall and Duchy of Lancaster estates, which are respectively owned by the Prince of Wales and the monarch, they're only voluntarily paying tax after pressure was put on them in 1992, when we had this extraordinary episode with after the Windsor fire, where the population were paying for the restoration of Windsor, which was actually meant to be a private home. And we've now got a case with Buckingham Palace where the public are paying for the restoration of Buckingham Palace, which is not going to be used by the monarch, but which the monies for as a visitor attraction are going to the Duchy of Lancaster, to Prince Charles's pocket. But no, they monitor themselves, and there's no oversight from any independent body. And that can't be right.
And can you talk about some of the other ways that powerful people and indeed the royals succeed in silencing researchers and historians? So, for example, things like super injunctions.
Yes, I mean the policy of the palace is generally, if they don't like something, is to deny something, and then when it's proved to be correct, they will often then try and put out other information or try and do a deal with the press. They will often brief against other members of the royal family to give a more positive view of what they call the principals, who are generally the people in the direct line of succession. They certainly rely a lot on lawyers, particularly Harbottle and Lewis, Farrar and Shillings. And we've seen that particularly with Prince Harry, but also with the King. The Queen wasn't adverse to going after people who, for example, signed NDAs and had broken those. Fergie and Andrew were constantly after staff for trying to sell stories about them at the very time that they were themselves going around publishers, or Fergie was, trying to sell stories, an autobiography. They also use injunctions or super injunctions where you're not even allowed to report the fact there is an injunction. I understand there are quite a lot of those around the Prince of Wales. So, this cannot, and of course, everyone who works at the Royals and has any sort of contact with them is signing NDAs. And they have huge PR teams. I'm told that a PR firm has been employed to try and discredit my book. I don't know who's paying them. So, there are lots of tools they can use to again narrate the narrative.
And while you were writing your book, what were some of the most shocking things you heard about the ways in which Andrew and Fergie were trying to shut down people talking to you or trying to keep people quiet?
Well, I mean, they were certainly, I had instances of going to interviews and them being curtailed because the person had got a text literally when I was there. I know that, I mean, this isn't a pressure from the royal household, but I mean, the ambassadors were told not to speak to me, for example. I suspect the word went out that people passed on the word to each other when I approached them, perhaps people who had served with them in the Navy. So, yeah, I think the word went around not to talk to me. There were attempts clearly to discredit me, to say I was a salacious gossip monger. I wasn't a serious historian. I was making it all up. And that's continued. It's continued on Twitter. You'll see that there are a whole series of accounts on Twitter with very few followers, all often operating in the same time in waves. We know bots have been used to try and discredit people in a whole series of situations. And someone actually a whistleblower had offered to talk to me about the bots that were being used against me, and then they wouldn't speak. So there is clearly we had experiences with the media who did interviews with me, and then the interviews never ran after pressure from on the proprietors. So there has been a pretty concerted campaign to try and minimize the impact of entitled. But the fact is, the evidence speaks for itself. It's all there, it's all heavily sourced. And it's backed up not just by me, but other people have come forward. So Tom Sykes, for example, came forward and said that he had stories about Andrew in Thailand with prostitutes from different sources. Ian Proud, a diplomat in Bangkok, spoke to Metro about his experiences with Andrew in Thailand. So it's not just me on my own. Other people are telling these stories.
How has your view of the country changed in the last 10 years since you started writing these kinds of books?
Well, my view of the institutions which I'd sort of grown up to trust and respect, the judiciary, the police, the civil service, the royal family, I'm afraid my trust in them has been pretty considerably undermined by my own experiences researching these books. And I didn't start off as a sort of conspiracy theorist and as some sort of maverick rebel. I started off writing literary biography. And it's only really in the course of doing research on both intelligence and then on the royals that I've come to see just how, as I say, curated the narrative is and how powerful various institutions can be in terms of the pressure they put on people. It's a mixture of patronage and pressure. So the patronage comes, you see, for example, several members of parliament are deeply involved in Andrew's trips abroad, now work for the royal household. You see how former members of the intelligence services tend to get jobs in the royal household. You see it in the gongs that are passed to various people. And people, I find it extraordinary, but seem prepared to swallow their principles in order to get a CBE or a knighthood or a peerage or whatever it is that they want.